Harold Butler set the table the way Martha liked it. Napkins folded into simple rectangles, plates warmed slightly in the oven so the roast would not cool too fast. 1 week had passed since the funeral. 7 days of polite calls and casseroles, of neighbors at the door speaking softly and then stepping back into the bright desert light. He had asked Sienna and Perry to come for dinner because he wanted the house to feel like a home again. He hoped to hear stories about Martha, and maybe laugh at something small and ordinary. The roses in the backyard were at their best, pink and red against the sand-colored wall, the air still warm from the afternoon sun. They sat down and tried to eat. Harold served slices of roast and passed a bowl of green beans that Martha always seasoned with lemon. Sienna stared at her plate and turned her wedding ring with her thumb. Perry leaned back in his chair and looked around the room as if judging the ceiling height and the space between windows. The silence felt heavy, but Harold kept his voice steady as he asked if the drive over had been easy, if the traffic on the main road had eased now that the spring visitors had gone. Sienna answered with 1 or 2 words, and then Perry cleared his throat. He spoke in a firm tone about the house being too big for one person, and said that assisted living would be safer. He added that a smaller place would be more appropriate at Harold's age. The word appropriate rang in Harold's ears, and seemed to draw the color out of the room. He had painted these walls with Martha. He had fixed the leaky faucet on a Sunday morning while she pinched dead blooms from the rose bushes, and told him to take his time. He had mowed the small strip of grass in summer heat while she brought a glass of iced tea to the shade of the porch. Appropriate did not match those memories. Harold set down his fork and folded his hands in his lap to keep them from trembling. He asked where they expected him to go. Perry explained in practical terms that there were good senior communities in Tempe and that the house would sell well, that it was the sensible thing to do. Sienna nodded and said that the house felt empty now and that the upkeep would be too much for him. He studied her face, the way her eyes slipped away from his, the way grief had made her sharper at the edges. Once, during a thunderstorm, she had run to his lap and pressed her face against his shirt, and he had counted her breaths and told her that he was right there. Now she could not meet his gaze. He thought of numbers because numbers had always steadied him. 38 years of marriage, 23 years in this house, 67 years of showing up on time and telling the truth and paying what he owed. He thought of the checks he had written for Sienna's future long before Perry was in the picture. He did not think of them as debts, only as parts of a promise a father makes. Family takes care of family, Martha used to say, but she followed that line with another, trust but verify. He could hear her voice in the soft rattle of the air conditioner and in the hum of the refrigerator door swinging closed. Perry kept talking, his tone smooth, as if he were guiding a client through a set of choices. He said that everyone would benefit if Harold moved out and that the sale would give Harold freedom. Freedom sounded like a salesman's word. It tried to dress up an exit and make it look like a gift. Harold looked at the roast cooling on the platter and wished Martha were here to pretend to scold him for overcooking the edges. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He chose to breathe in, breathe out, and keep his seat until the shaking in his hands settled. He asked again where they expected him to sleep, if not here. The answer came in the same practical language. Sienna added that she could help him tour a place by the end of the month, and she said it in a careful way, like a teacher speaking to a child who might not understand. The words carried a thin layer of kindness, but not the weight of love. Harold let the quiet stretch. He could feel the solid wood of the table under his fingers, the table he and Martha had saved for. The table where Sienna had blown out candles and where school projects had been glued together late at night. He could see a smear of varnish in one corner where Martha laughed and said they were better at living than at sanding. He pushed his chair back slowly. The legs made a soft scrape against the floor, the same sound he heard when he rose to say grace or carry out a birthday cake. He told them that he understood. He reached for his jacket at the hall closet, the one Martha had slipped a lavender sachet into years ago. He put it on and felt the familiar weight at his shoulders. Behind him, Perry said that they would help him look at places in the morning and that it was the smart choice. Sienna lifted her chin, but did not speak. Harold did not answer. He opened the front door and stepped into the evening light. The desert air held the last warmth of the day. The sky was turning from pale gold to soft blue, and a mockingbird called from somewhere beyond the wall. The roses carried a clean scent that made him think of Martha's hands. He stood for a moment on the porch and looked in through the front windows. The lamps gave a friendly glow to the living room. Martha had chosen those lamps herself because the shades softened the light and made people look kinder. He closed the door gently so the latch would not click too loud. He walked to the edge of the path and then turned back to look at the door again, not because he doubted, but because he wanted to remember this exact second and the choice inside it. He did not go to the bedroom to fold shirts into a suitcase. He did not look for boxes in the garage or pull tape across cardboard. He walked to his car. The leather seat had warmed in the sun and gave off the faint scent of saddle soap. He set both hands on the wheel and felt, for the first time since the funeral, that something inside him had shifted from raw hurt to clear purpose. He did not know every step, but he knew the first one. He drove around the block once and parked under the slow whir of a streetlight that would blink on after full dark. He sat and listened to the neighborhood settling down. A dog barked and then fell quiet. A pair of sprinklers started their soft ticking dance along a front lawn. He thought of Martha's voice again and the way she wrinkled her nose when he told her about a new policy he was trying to set at the bank. She had said to trust people, but to verify and to keep good records, and to take his time. He rested his hands in his lap and let that counsel anchor him. When he returned to the house, the dishes on the table had cooled and the room felt still. He cleared the plates and ran warm water in the sink, moving one task at a time, steady and unhurried. He dried the good knives by hand because Martha always insisted on that, and he set them away in their wooden block. He straightened the napkins, even though no one was coming back to finish the meal. Then he walked down the hall to his study where the desk lamp painted a small circle of light on the blotter. He opened the top drawer and saw the ledger he kept for household expenses, his pen lined up with the ruler, the envelopes stacked square. The small order of that drawer steadied him more than any speech could have done. Tomorrow would be for calls and for facts and for careful questions. Tonight was for quiet and for choosing who he would be in the face of what had been said. He turned off the lamp and stood for a long moment in the doorway of the study, feeling the soft hum of the house around him, the house he had built with time and patience and the love of a good woman. He stepped back into the hall, took his jacket from the chair, and moved toward the front door. He closed the front door behind him and thinks, not to pack, to the bank. Morning light fell in clean rectangles across Harold's study, turning dust into slow-moving stars above the desk. He stood for a moment with his hands on the back of the chair, feeling the weight of the house settle around him. The ledger lay where he had left it, lined paper smoothed by years of careful entries. He opened the drawer that Martha used to tease him about, the one with envelopes stacked square and a ruler that never wandered. He took out a yellow pad and wrote a short list in tidy block letters. Then he reached for the folder that held the long story of a father's open hand. He began with the oldest entries. He wrote the name of the college in a precise hand and the amount next to it. There was the spring tuition, the dorm payment, the meal plan, the books. He could still hear Sienna's voice after the ceremony, breathless and young, saying that she could not believe what he had done for her. He remembered how Martha had squeezed his fingers until her wedding ring pressed a circle into his palm. He turned the page and wrote the next chapter. A down payment on the little house Sienna had wanted so badly. He wrote the number, the month, the bank, the check that cleared before sunrise. He added the wedding, a line of figures that paid for flowers, and a band, and photographs that made everyone look a little more hopeful. Then he made a column for the smaller rescues, the moments when a car broke down or the gap between bills and paychecks opened like a sudden ditch. He did not write any interest owed beside these numbers. He never had. He drew a quiet line at the bottom and let the total sit without comment. The phone on the desk chimed with a calendar reminder he had set years ago. It was a little thing, but it steadied him. He rolled the pen between his fingers and thought of Martha saying that records told the truest story. Trust, but verify, she liked to add. and then she would smile and change the subject to dinner. He put on his navy suit, the one that made him stand a little taller, and drove to Desert Community Bank in downtown Scottsdale. The building's glass reflected the desert sky and the white of high clouds as he walked through doors that still opened with the same slow whoosh. He greeted the receptionist by name because good manners never go out of style. She brightened and said it was good to see him. When he sat across from James Morrison in a corner office lined with family photos and a neat stack of file folders, he felt the old calm of a workday return to his hands. They spoke first about Martha, because that was right. James poured coffee and said that she had always been gracious to the staff. Harold thanked him, then asked to review accounts on which he had standing as a co-signer. James's expression shifted into professional focus. He turned his screen slightly, and together they looked at the lines that could bruise a life. The mortgage payments had slid out of rhythm months ago. The home equity line was fully drawn. The loan for equipment tied to Perry's construction outfit had stopped breathing and now showed a number that had grown fat on penalties and compound interest. James explained the exposure with the care of a man who had learned to be both clear and kind. If defaults continued, Harold's own credit would not be spared. Harold listened without flinching. He had been around numbers long enough to let them tell him what they needed to tell. He asked for printed histories and a simple report that listed dates and balances and the terms that had been missed. James nodded, already tapping the keys. Before Harold left, they shook hands with the easy respect of men who had walked the same corridors for many years. In the quiet of the elevator, Harold held the folder against his chest, the paper still warm from the printer, and closed his eyes for the length of one floor. He stepped into the brightness of late morning and walked 2 blocks to common grounds. The bell over the door gave its small, polite ring, and the air lifted with coffee and cinnamon. A couple of regulars nodded at him. He ordered a plain coffee and left a tip that made the young cashier straighten with surprise. He chose a booth where he could see the street and set the bank folder beside the napkin dispenser. Margaret Walsh from First National spotted him and smiled as if the day had just improved. She slid into the opposite side of the booth when he invited her to sit. They spoke about neighbors and the heat and the spring visitors who kept everyone busy. When the talk drifted, as it always did in a small city, to the industry that paid the bills, she mentioned that applications with high debt-to-income ratios had multiplied. She said there was a run of desperate files lately, the kind where missed payments and multiple inquiries ate away at a score like moths at cloth. She did not name names. She did not need to. She knew Harold knew how to read between the lines, and he knew she would never say more than she should. Harold listened as if to a weather report. He did not take notes. He did not push the conversation. When they stood, he thanked her for the company and wished her an easy afternoon. He walked out into the light and felt the heat wrap his suit jacket like a careful hand. He did not hurry. Back in his study, Harold spread the printouts on the desk as a man might lay out maps. He did not need to mark them. The dates and amounts told a story that did not bend with wishes. He placed his old calculator beside the legal pad because the weight of it brought a kind of peace. Then he began to align the figures with his memories. Tuition lined up with a young woman's joyful tears. A down payment lined up with her first set of keys on a silver ring. A wedding lined up with the father-daughter dance where she had whispered that he had made it perfect. Smaller rescues lined up with late-night calls and breathless thanks that had faded into everyday noise by morning. He did not let resentment color these lines. He let the truth do the work. He read through the report again. The mortgage had been late for months. The home equity line was tapped out. The equipment loan had failed. The pattern was not an accident. It was a cliff edge. He set one hand on Martha's framed photograph and felt the quiet steadiness return. He made a short list of questions in case a lawyer would need to see the full picture. He wrote the names of 3 attorneys he trusted from his working years, not because he was ready to sue anyone, but because good counsel is a kind of shelter. Late afternoon brought a soft message tone from his phone. Sienna had sent a line that looked cheerful at the surface. She had found a lovely assisted living place. It would be appropriate and could be arranged before the end of the month. He imagined her scrolling through pictures on a glossy website and telling herself that this was kindness. He let the message sit unanswered, not as punishment, but because silence was the only response that would not open the wrong door. He stepped outside and stood by the roses until the shade reached the patio stones. A mockingbird tried out a dozen songs as if auditioning for the evening. The air smelled of dust and green things and the faint memory of dinner from a neighbor's kitchen. When the light thinned, he went back inside and turned on the desk lamp. He straightened the stack of papers once more and placed the pen in its place. He folded his hands and allowed himself one slow breath for Martha, one for the home they had built, and one for the path ahead that would require both patience and spine. He picked up his phone and opened his contacts, scrolling through names that had once rung his office phone with the force of a day's work. Harold scrolls his phone for attorneys and old contacts. He thinks, "They believe I am an easy mark. They have misread the man who kept every receipt." The next morning, the air in the small apartment felt heavier than usual. Perry had already left for whatever odd job he could scrape together, leaving Sienna at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of overdue bills. She kept running her thumb over the red final notice stamp like it might fade if she rubbed hard enough. Outside, a delivery truck rattled past, and for a moment she imagined it pulling up to her father's house, the house she once thought of as hers by inheritance, dropping off something new and expensive. The bitterness that thought stirred was almost as sharp as the fear gnawing at her. Meanwhile, Harold sipped his coffee in the quiet glow of his own kitchen. He'd spent most of the night reviewing the documents James from the bank had sent over, cross-referencing dates and payment schedules. Every overdue notice, every missed payment, every interest charge told a story of two people living in denial until reality kicked the door in. He didn't feel pity, at least not anymore, just a clinical interest in how quickly the cracks were spreading. By mid-morning, Perry's old truck rolled into a construction yard on the edge of town. The foreman barely looked up from his clipboard before shaking his head. No work today. Maybe next week. Perry muttered something under his breath and headed back to the truck, his pride grinding lower with every rejection. The gas gauge was flirting with empty, but he didn't have enough cash to fill it. He sat behind the wheel for a full minute, staring at nothing, before turning the key and driving off toward nowhere in particular. That afternoon, Harold made a call to an old friend at the city's inspection office. It was a casual conversation on the surface, just two retirees catching up, but every question Harold slipped in had purpose. By the time he hung up, he knew exactly which of Perry's side jobs were skating on thin ice with permits and insurance. He didn't have to lift a finger beyond that. The right whispers would do the rest. Sienna spent the day making calls of her own. Her sister in California, an old college friend, even her former boss. Every conversation ended the same way, sympathy in their voices, but no offers of money. By 4 o'clock, she sat on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest, scrolling through her contacts with the numb realization that there was no one left to ask except the man she'd told to pack his bags. As evening fell, Harold stepped into Martha's rose garden. The blooms were perfect this year, deep red and impossibly fragrant. She'd always said roses needed both care and ruthless pruning, and he found the metaphor fitting. He thought about the upcoming meeting he'd orchestrated, the one that would put Perry and Sienna right where he wanted them, desperate enough to agree to anything. Across town, Perry walked into the apartment with a paper bag from the liquor store. Sienna didn't even look up as he set it on the counter. "We're out of options," she said flatly. "We're not," he replied, though his voice carried no conviction. "Your father has the money." Her eyes finally met his, and for the first time in weeks, there was no anger, just exhaustion. "Then I guess we know where we're going tomorrow." Harold was still in the garden when the porch light flicked on. He glanced at the clock, knowing it wouldn't be long now. Somewhere in the quiet, a car engine turned over. And then, in the fading light, headlights swept across his driveway. By late morning, the heat had settled over Scottsdale like a heavy blanket. the kind that pressed against metal and glass until everything felt slow. Harold parked beneath a thin scrap of shade near the edge of a construction site that smelled of dust and sun-baked lumber. He kept the engine off so he could hear. A compressor coughed and died. Hammers went quiet one by one. The foreman stood with a clipboard and a phone at his ear, jaw tight, eyes moving from the idle concrete truck to the stack of rebar that would not be set today. Perry paced a few yards away, shoulders squared in a way that tried to look confident and only managed to look tense. He took a call, turned away, nodded, and then pinched the bridge of his nose as if he could hold the day together with 2 fingers. Harold did not step out. He would never embarrass anyone at their workplace. He watched as 2 workers folded orange vests into tool buckets and climbed into pickups with the slow resignation of people who had waited through too many false starts. The foreman finally walked over to Perry, spoke for less than a minute, and pointed toward the street. No raised voices, no scene, just the plain language of a shutdown. The last steady income slipped an inch closer to the edge. Harold wrote the time in a small notebook he had used for years. He did not need many words. A line for the hour, a line for the contact he would call later to confirm what his eyes already told him. He sat a few minutes more, letting the heat press through the windshield until even the pen felt warm, then turned the key and let the air move again. He eased onto the road and headed for home, making a short stop at the public library on the way. In the cool quiet of the business research room, he moved from screen to screen with the calm pace of an old habit. He searched corporate filings, permit logs, insurance notices. The dates whispered their neat truths. Late premium, return notice, incomplete safety plan. He printed nothing confidential, only what any careful citizen could find. He slid each page into a simple paper folder. His hands were steady, his shirt collar smooth against his neck, his mind clear. He did not accuse anyone of anything. He simply prepared for questions that would travel through the proper channels once the right people asked them. Back in his study, light from the garden gathered on the desk blotter. He arranged the new pages beside James's printouts from the bank and the neat list he had made of past gifts. The pattern that had been faint a week ago now looked like a road map with thick, dark lines. He ran his finger down a column of dates and let it rest where mortgage payments had fallen behind, then where the home equity line had been pulled to its limit, then where the equipment note had gone into default. He set the pen aside and allowed one breath for the old ache of disappointment to pass, then returned to the work of protecting himself without spite. Across town, Perry idled in a convenience store lot with both hands on the wheel, staring at the cracked vinyl crest that had peeled away from the center of the steering wheel over the years. He called one contact, then another, each call shorter than the last. He put the phone face down on the passenger seat and watched the gas gauge slide toward the letter that meant the next stop would not be a job, but a gas station. The sun glared on the chrome edge of the pump handles, turning them into useless mirrors. Sienna spent the late morning on her apartment porch with a notepad and a phone that felt heavier each time she picked it up. She tried her sister again. She tried a former coworker who had once promised to help if she ever needed a favor. She tried a college friend who now lived back east and had a voice that might have sounded sympathetic if it had not been so distant. She said the words that were hardest to say and still ended each call with thanks and a promise she could not keep. The porch boards held the heat like a secret. She pressed her toes against them and tried not to think about the notice taped to the inside of the kitchen cabinet. In the early afternoon, Harold drove a slow loop past the small apartment complex where Sienna and Perry lived. He did not stop. He did not stare. He simply noted the hood of Sienna's car propped up and a thin ribbon of steam curling into the blue air. She stood beside the fender, phone to her ear, her free hand resting on the metal as if she could calm it. A neighbor offered a shrug and a wave that meant he wished her well but had nothing to give. Harold turned the corner and let the scene fall away in the rearview mirror. He was not running a rescue. He was drawing a boundary. He returned home and made tea. The kitchen held that late-day quiet that always made the house feel thoughtful. He rinsed the mug and set it on the rack, then sat at the desk and opened his notebook. He wrote down the name of the insurance contact who had promised to confirm whether coverage was current. He wrote down the number of the municipal clerk who had been exact and polite about permit requirements. He did not push any of them. He never would. He simply asked the right questions, shared the relevant dates, and thanked them for their time. The system did not need a shove. It only needed a light touch to make sure it saw what was already there. Toward late afternoon, a credit alert buzzed on his phone. He read it once, then a second time to make sure he did not let emotion drag the meaning in a different direction. A new application. A swift denial. The pattern repeated itself like a drumbeat. He wrote the lender's name in the margin and underlined it. He stood and stretched his back, then stepped out to the garden. The air smelled of warm earth and roses. The shadows were just beginning to lengthen, softening the edges of the block wall until it looked almost like stone in an old garden. He clipped one spent bloom and dropped it into the bucket, remembering the way Martha would purse her lips when she found a black spot and then brighten when a perfect petal opened the next day. She had believed in pruning as an act of care. He believed that too. Let what is diseased go, so that what is healthy can breathe. As the sun lowered, he took a short drive again, not because he expected anything in particular, but because motion sometimes allowed the day to settle in the mind. He paused at the corner coffee stand and ordered plain coffee from a teenager who was learning to speak in full sentences to older customers. Harold left a tip and took his cup back to the car. From that quiet vantage, he could see the street that led to the apartment. A couple argued gently over a stroller wheel. A dog pulled at a leash and then gave up and sat down in the shade. The world kept turning on its ordinary hinge. From somewhere down the block, a sharper sound rose, not a shout, but the start of voices that did not fit the peaceful picture. Harold set the coffee in the holder and listened without leaning forward. A phrase carried on the dry air, then another, too faint to catch but clear enough in tone. He did not need words to know the shape of the conversation. He let the window down an inch to feel the air better and to remind himself that he was not hiding, only paying attention. He drove home at an easy pace. Inside the study, the last line of light from the garden lay across the carpet like a bookmark. He sat, set the notebook in front of him, and turned to a fresh page. The room was so quiet, he could hear the soft tick of the wall clock. He wrote down what he had seen and what he had not seen. He wrote down what had been confirmed and what still needed a name beside it. When he finished, he closed the cover and rested both hands on it as if it were a good book that deserved respect. Through the open window of the apartment, Harold hears the start of an argument. He closes his notebook and thinks, "Tomorrow will tell me more." The day began like many in Scottsdale, with the sun already bright by breakfast and the air conditioner lifting a steady breath through quiet rooms. Harold stepped into the yard with pruning shears and a small pail, moving slowly along Martha's rose beds. He clipped one browned bloom and then another, careful not to rush, careful not to let his mind jump ahead of the day. Beyond the block wall, the neighborhood stirred. A dog barked once. Tires hissed along warm asphalt. Somewhere a screen door shut with a soft wooden thud. He let ordinary sounds set the rhythm of his hands. He had learned that simple tasks could hold a man steady while bigger matters sorted themselves. Down the street, on a shaded porch no larger than a rug, Sienna lifted her phone and tried again. She had not slept much. She had written a list of names after midnight and now worked down the page one by one. Her sister in California answered on the second ring, voice careful and sweet. But there was a child crying in the background and a mortgage of her own to meet, and the call ended with a promise to check in soon. An old college friend took longer to pick up and sounded exactly like a woman who remembered shared laughter, but had made a habit of saying no to hard requests. Sienna thanked her anyway. She thanked them all. She held the phone in both hands like it might ask for less if she touched it gently. Perry left early and came back before noon with heat on his face and frustration under his breath. He set his keys on the counter and stared at the fridge without opening it, then reached over the sink to pull open the cabinet where they had taped the most recent letter from the mortgage company. He read it again, even though he knew every line. Sienna watched from the table and made herself breathe through a tightness that felt like a belt around her ribs. He said he would try again after lunch. She said nothing. Harold finished the first bed and straightened, hand at his lower back for a second. He was not a young man, but he was not fragile either. He moved to the next row and felt the old peace that had carried him through harder seasons than this one. He could hear faint voices from the direction of the apartment complex when the wind shifted, the rise and fall of syllables without the words. It sounded like a couple trying to keep a lid on their distress and failing. He clipped a stem and set the spent bloom in the bucket. Perry returned twice that afternoon with small boxes from a store on the corner and a paper bag that rattled with glass. He did not meet Sienna's eyes as he set them down. She opened one box and found a watch wrapped in tissue and a thin gold chain she had worn on a birthday years ago. He said it was only for a while, that they would buy everything back, that the shopkeeper had said the items would be held for 30 days. She closed the lid and felt something inside her go still. It was not anger anymore. It was something flatter, like the ground after a long dry spell. He said he would make more calls. She nodded. He left again. Late in the day, the heat pulled a haze off the street. Harold rinsed his hands at the outdoor spigot and went inside to make iced tea. The kitchen held that soft clink of glass and ice that always made him think of Martha bringing a sweating glass out to the porch. He poured the tea and took a slow swallow, then carried the glass to his study and set it beside the neat stack of folders. He checked the time, checked his phone, and placed both back on the desk. The house felt like a held breath, calm but attentive, as if it knew visitors would come when the light began to turn. On the apartment porch, the argument broke its careful shell. It was Sienna's voice first, not loud at the start, but thin with strain, then stronger, then cracking. She had started with questions about dates and balances, and had run out of surface questions and moved to the ones with sharp edges. When she asked how he could keep $78,000 from her, Perry spread his hands and said he had been trying to save the business. She said the business had swallowed their savings, their credit, and now their trust. He said the foreman had cut him loose and that the inspector was calling about paperwork, like there was a list of mistakes he had not made that someone wanted to pin on him anyway. She said she did not care who was to blame for the last part if he was to blame for the first part. The porch made those words louder than they might have been inside. A neighbor paused at the mailbox, faced the other way, and moved on. Harold watered the small strip of grass by the roses to keep it alive through the hottest days. He turned the spray low so it would not mist over the wall and listened without stepping closer. He did not want anyone to feel watched. He did not need to be near to understand what was happening. Hard truths seldom stay quiet, no matter how far they travel. Sienna made more calls. She called a woman from church who had once sat beside her during a candlelight service and held her hand when an old hymn rolled through the sanctuary. The woman's voice was kind, but she could offer only a reference for a financial counselor and a promise to pray. Sienna wrote down the number and set the pen down without dialing. She called Rebecca and this time asked her to come by. Rebecca pulled up, stayed an hour, and left with the face of someone who wanted to help and was grateful not to be asked for money. When the door closed behind her, the apartment seemed to shrink. Perry paced the small living room, phone to his ear. He called a man who owed him for a side job, then another man who owed him for a favor, and came away with apologies and stories and not $1. He checked a still-open credit card and saw a number that made his ears ring. He closed the app and rubbed his forehead hard enough to leave a mark. He started to say they should ask Harold together. Sienna answered that they would have asked weeks ago if they had treated him with the respect he deserved. As the sun slipped toward the low line of roofs, the argument moved outside. The words reached farther there, and Harold caught more of them than he wanted. She had set the dates in order. She had counted the missed payments and the letters and the promises. She had counted the days left. She backed away from Perry and sat on the top step and pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. Then she said it. They had 6 days before the lender moved from warning to acceleration. It came out on a breath that broke in the middle. It carried across the quiet of the block and reached Harold where he stood beside the hose. He closed the spigot and listened to the last water run through the length of hose and then fall silent. The garden smelled deep and sweet in the small coolness that comes before night in the desert. He thought about how Martha used to schedule appointments around the heat of the day, and how she put every deadline on the calendar in ink so she could see it each morning without hunting for it. He thought about the terms that would be needed to repair what could be repaired. He was not thinking of punishment. He was thinking of structure, of honesty, of the kind of conditions that could hold two people steady who had not been steady in a long time. Sienna stood and spoke softer now, asking Perry to sit and listen. She said they would go to her father and tell the truth. She said there would be no part of the past left out, not the business, not the credit cards, not the loan applications that had been denied. She said she would apologize for what she had allowed at the dinner table, and she said it like a promise. Perry looked down at his hands and nodded once. He did not know what apology would cost, but he understood what pride had already cost them. Streetlights rose with a slow electric hum. A breeze found its way along the block wall and made the roses whisper. Harold stood still a moment longer and let the sound pass over him. He considered the timing. He considered the place in the living room where the conversation should happen and the papers he would bring to the coffee table. He planned the language he would use, calm and exact, with no words that could be mistaken for cruelty. He carried the hose to its hook and coiled it until the loops lay neat and flat. He walked the length of the beds one more time to make sure the water had not pooled where it would invite rot. He ran his thumb along a leaf and felt the tiny ridges catch his skin. He stepped back to see the whole of the garden as if it were a picture hung in a frame. Then he turned toward the house and took a breath that filled his chest and let it out slowly. Harold turns back to the roses, thinking, 6 days is more than enough for the terms to take shape. The morning light in Scottsdale stretched long across Harold's garden, warming the roses and casting gentle shadows against the stucco wall. He stepped out with his tea, the same way he had for years, though today felt heavier. On the table inside, the stack of papers lay neatly arranged, each page a quiet witness to the truth. He had rehearsed the conversation in his mind, not to sharpen it into a weapon, but to smooth the edges so no word could cut where it did not need to. He knew they would come soon, and he wanted the house to feel calm when they did. Just before 9, the sound of a car door closing reached through the open window. Harold moved to the front door, but he did not open it until the second knock. Perry and Sienna stood there, the weight of sleepless nights showing in their faces. She held her hands clasped tightly, as though keeping herself from speaking too soon. Perry's gaze shifted between Harold and the papers on the coffee table, and then he stepped inside without being asked. Harold gestured toward the couch, waited until they sat, and took his chair across from them. The silence was not empty. It was full of the things they had avoided saying for months. Harold reached for the first folder, the one with the mortgage dates in a steady column. He set it in front of them without flourish. "These," he said softly, "tell me more than you thought they would." He did not accuse. He let the ink speak for itself. Sienna glanced at the pages and then at Perry, her eyes a quiet storm. Perry nodded once, as if bracing against a wave he could not stop. They talked about the work that had stopped, the equipment payments that had gone unpaid, the credit pulled until there was nothing left to pull. Harold listened without interrupting, his hands folded on his knee. When they finished, he opened the next folder, the one with the insurance lapse and the permit issues. He explained that these things could be fixed, but not if they were hidden. He looked at Sienna when he said it, and she met his eyes without flinching. For the first time in many years, they spoke about trust, not as an idea, but as a currency more valuable than any loan. Harold told them he was willing to help, but only with terms that honored the truth. There would be no more surprises, no more quiet debts building in the shadows. Perry asked what those terms would be. Harold answered plainly: full access to accounts, monthly meetings at the house, and a clear plan for repayment, not because he needed the money back, but because they needed to feel the weight of earning it. The room stayed quiet for a moment after that. Then Sienna said she agreed. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. Perry hesitated, then nodded. It was not the relief of rescue. It was the acceptance of responsibility. Harold felt the air shift, the way it does when a storm decides to move on without breaking. They spent the rest of the morning going through the papers, signing where they needed to sign, making notes about deadlines and phone calls. Harold served coffee mid-morning, setting the mugs on coasters Martha had bought decades ago. He noticed how Sienna ran her fingers along the rim of hers, as if grounding herself in something solid. Perry leaned forward, elbows on knees, reading each page like a man determined to understand every line. By noon, the plan was written out in clear steps. Harold told them he would call a contact to help with the permits and another to speak to the bank. He also told them that if either of them felt the urge to hide something, they should come to the garden instead and talk it out. The roses, he said, had heard worse and still bloomed. When they left, the day had grown warm enough to make the air shimmer above the street. Sienna turned back at the car, met Harold's eyes, and mouthed a silent thank you. Perry raised a hand in a small wave. Not quite a smile, but close enough to mean something. Harold stood in the doorway until they turned the corner. Inside, he gathered the papers into one folder and placed it in the drawer of his desk. He stepped out into the garden, the scent of roses wrapping around him. The work was not finished, but the ground was tilled. It was enough for now. The petals shifted in the breeze, and somewhere beyond the wall, a neighbor's wind chime gave a soft, steady note. Harold rested his hand on the back of the chair Martha used to favor and looked toward the horizon. The past weeks had tested more than finances. They had tested character. And in that quiet test, he had found the answer he needed. Not all debts are paid with money. Some are cleared only when the truth is spoken and carried forward in the open air. He turned back toward the roses, thinking, the terms are set, and now they will have to live by them. The days that followed did not turn into easy days. Bills still came, the work did not appear overnight, and trust did not grow back in a single conversation. But the air between them had changed. There was less hiding and more reporting. Perry kept the permit appointments Harold had arranged. Sienna called each week with updates, sometimes good, sometimes hard, but always on time. The work of repairing their situation was slow, but it was honest. In his garden, Harold found a new rhythm. He still clipped the spent blooms, still watered in the cool hours, still checked the soil the way Martha had taught him. But now, when he looked at the roses, he saw more than beauty. He saw proof that pruning was not loss, it was preparation. What was cut away made room for what could thrive. Neighbors began to notice that Harold seemed lighter. He smiled more often in the coffee shop, stayed a few minutes longer in conversation at the library. It was not because his life had suddenly grown easy. It was because he had taken back the quiet power of choosing his own terms. He was no longer the man being told to leave his own home. He was the man who had stayed, and stayed well, with his dignity and his word intact. The lesson was not loud. It did not need to be. It was there in the steady way Harold kept his promises to himself. Being underestimated had given him the advantage of surprise, and using that advantage with patience had given him something better than revenge. It had given him peace. For anyone listening, the truth is simple. When people misjudge your worth, you do not have to match their opinion. You can let the facts and your quiet consistency do the speaking. Boundaries, once set with clarity, are a kind of freedom. And freedom, like a well-tended garden, must be cared for every day. In the soft evening light, Harold sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the scent of roses drifting in from the garden. Somewhere down the block, a mockingbird called out a string of borrowed songs. He listened, not for what was borrowed, but for what was carried well.